The boy had no name that anyone remembered, for he was known only as the homeless wanderer of the valley, a thin figure with torn clothes and weary eyes, who spent his days drifting from one quiet corner of the mountains to another, searching for scraps of food and places to rest his tired body. Life had been merciless, yet somewhere within his fragile frame lived a spark of resilience that refused to die, and it was this spark that pushed him forward, even when hunger clawed at his ribs and loneliness weighed upon his heart. One evening, as the crimson sun melted behind the jagged peaks, he stumbled upon a sight that would change his destiny forever. A young native girl crouched beside a cold stream, trembling with exhaustion. She looked frightened, glancing over her shoulder at every sound, and the boy felt something stir deep inside him. A call stronger than his own hunger, the call of compassion. Approaching gently so as not to startle her, he offered the only thing he had, a small piece of stale bread he had saved for himself, and though her eyes widened with both caution and gratitude, she accepted it with trembling hands. When she spoke, her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper carried on the mountain wind, and though he could not understand all of her words, he realized she was lost and far from her people. The night grew colder, shadows stretched long, and the boy knew that leaving her alone would mean certain danger from wolves or the freezing air. So without hesitation, he extended his hand and motioned for her to follow. Together they moved across narrow trails and steep ridges, the boy leading with a determination that surprised even himself, guiding her step by step through the wilderness as if fate had placed him there for this very moment. Each rustle in the dark made his heart pound, yet he pressed on, whispering reassurances though he had no certainty of safety, only a belief that helping her mattered more than his own fear. As the stars bloomed above like scattered lanterns, the unlikely pair found a shallow cave where they could rest, and in the silence between them a bond began to form, one built not on words but on trust. The night settled heavy upon the mountains as the boy trudged along behind the girl, his bare feet aching against the cold stones, yet his spirit strangely light. For the first time in days, he was not alone. She walked ahead with quiet grace, her braided hair swaying as the moon cast silver across the jagged ridges. And though she spoke little, the glance she offered him now and then carried more comfort than words could. The boy, who had spent weeks wandering hungry and without shelter, felt a purpose awaken in his chest. Helping her across these perilous paths gave his broken life sudden meaning. Every rustle of leaves, every howl of wolves from distant valleys stirred his fear. Yet when he saw how calmly she carried herself, clutching only a small pouch and the weight of her people's trust, he drew courage from her presence. The wind cut sharp against their faces, but they pressed on, climbing narrow ledges where one misstep would send them tumbling into darkness. He thought of firelight he once saw in a family's home long ago, and wondered if warmth would ever embrace him again. And somehow he believed it would if he could just see this journey through. The girl finally paused at a plateau, pointing toward the valley below where the faint glow of distant fires shimmered, and she whispered that her tribe was waiting beyond the ridge. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with hope that once they arrived she might be safe, and perhaps he might find more than just survival, maybe belonging. That night, beneath a sky scattered with stars, they rested upon the rocky ground, the boy lying awake as the weight of destiny pressed upon him, unaware that by aiding this girl, he had already set in motion a story that would echo far beyond the mountains and into the hearts of warriors who would soon come searching for the boy who had shown kindness when none was expected. The stars above the mountains flickered like distant promises, but the weight of uncertainty pressed hard on his heart. He had never known comfort, never known what it felt like to truly belong. Yet the kindness he had shown the native girl earlier that day gave him a strange sense of purpose. She had been weak, struggling to climb the rough trails, her face pale from hunger and exhaustion, and it was his hands that had steadied her, his voice that had urged her to keep moving. Now, in the silence of the dark valley, he wondered if his small act of compassion would change anything for him. At dawn, the first rays of sunlight painted the rocks in shades of gold, and the boy rose, brushing off the dust from his worn clothes. He stepped outside the barn to gather water, but then froze. His heart pounded as he saw shapes emerging from the mist, horses, many of them hooves striking the earth in unison. He rubbed his eyes, half believing he was still dreaming. But the vision grew clearer. 30 warriors, dressed in traditional attire, feathers glinting in the morning light, rode toward him in a powerful formation. At the front was the same girl he had helped, now strong and radiant, sitting proudly behind a tall warrior whose stern gaze never left the boy. Dust swirled around them as they halted before the barn, the silence thick enough to break his breath. The boy's hands trembled. He had no family, no weapons, nothing to defend himself with. Yet something deep within told him this moment wasn't about fear. It was about destiny. The cold wind whistled through the narrow passes of the mountain as the homeless boy trudged onward, his thin clothes barely shielding him from the biting air. Yet his spirit burned strong with determination. Beside him, the native girl walked silently, her eyes sharp and alert, guiding him with gestures and whispers of ancient trails known only to her people. Every step felt heavier as the rocky path twisted higher, yet the boy pressed on, refusing to abandon her. After making a promise to see her safely across the mountains, the night before, he had shared with her his last piece of bread, and though hunger gnawed at him now, the warmth of knowing he had eased her suffering gave him strength. Around them, the looming cliffs seemed alive with shadows, the cries of distant wolves echoing against the stone walls. But the girl reassured him, with quiet words that her ancestors watched over their path. As dawn broke, painting the horizon in gold and crimson, the two reached a high ridge from where the valley stretched endlessly below, its forests thick and mysterious. The girl, exhausted yet hopeful, looked at him with gratitude in her eyes, as though she had found more than just a guide, perhaps a brother in spirit, someone who understood pain and survival. The boy, though weary, felt a fire in his heart he had never known before. For the first time, he was not walking aimlessly, not just a wanderer lost to the world, but a protector with purpose. Yet, as they descended the ridge, he sensed an unseen presence, the subtle rustle of leaves, the faint sound of hooves in the distance, as though their journey was being watched. He did not know that every step closer to the valley was carrying him toward a fate far greater than hunger and survival. A destiny that would shake his world when morning came and 30 warriors would stand before his door, summoned by the bond he had unknowingly forged in those silent mountain paths. Native girl was filled with hardship and quiet determination, and though his clothes were torn and his feet blistered, he pressed on with an inner strength he never knew he had. The air grew colder the higher they climbed, and sharp winds carried the smell of pine and stone. But he kept his focus on making sure the girl was safe. Sometimes she stumbled, weak from hunger and exhaustion, lifting her up with gentle words that gave her courage. The nights were the hardest, when darkness swallowed the narrow trails, and the howls of wolves echoed in the distance. Yet he refused to let fear show on his face. He built small fires with trembling hands, shielding her from the cold, and though his stomach ached with emptiness, he gave her most of the little food he found, because he knew her survival mattered more than his own. As they crossed a frozen stream, the girl whispered something in her native tongue, her eyes shining with gratitude, and though he didn't understand the words, he felt the weight of her trust settle deep in his heart. For the first time in a long time, the boy who once wandered alone, invisible and forgotten, felt that his life had a purpose beyond himself. The path ahead was uncertain, but with each step, he realized he was no longer just a homeless boy lost in the world. He was becoming a protector, a guide, and maybe even a brother to someone who needed him the most. And though he had no way of knowing what awaited him once they reached her people, a quiet hope began to stir within him, as if the mountains themselves were whispering that this act of kindness would change his fate forever.